The problem isn't pleasure. The problem is the price he charges afterwards. Almost no one notices this at first, because pleasure always arrives with a smile. He promises rest, relief, reward, but it demands silence, discipline, and a future. Solomon observed something unsettling. People don't break all at once. They dissolve little by little, in small, comfortable, and repetitive choices. Immediate pleasure doesn't destroy the day it's born. It destroys the day it becomes a habit. And today, more than ever, this pleasure is everywhere. In easy consumption, in constant distraction. Not just today, not I deserve it. In a comfort that seems harmless. If you stay until the end, you'll understand why Solomon warned so much about unquestioned pleasures, and how a single one of them can cost you years of your life, without making a sound. Subscribe to the channel now. Here, Solomon wasn't teaching how to earn more. He taught them how to make fewer mistakes. Solomon understood that pleasure rarely presents itself as a threat. He arrives as a relief, as a break, as a silent reward after a difficult day. No one chooses pleasure based on the cost, because pleasure is never about price. He doesn't warn you what he's going to take away. It only shows what it promises to deliver now. Solomon observed that the greatest losses in life do not begin with major mistakes. They begin with small emotional concessions, an added comfort, an untimely distraction, a choice made to avoid inconvenience. Immediate pleasure creates the illusion of control. The person believes they can stop whenever they want. It's just a moment. That makes no difference. But Solomon warned, what you repeat without thinking begins to think for you. Pleasure doesn't demand everything at once. He pays the cost in installments. And the less pain there is now, the higher the price will be later. Solomon saw strong men weaken not because of external crises, but because of internal habits. They didn't fall suddenly. They settled in. Pleasure became a refuge, and the refuge, over time, turned into a prison. Today, this is repeated, albeit in a different guise. Pleasure is available all the time. No waiting required. No preparation is required. It doesn't require merit. It fits in your pocket, on the phone. No sofa. Solomon understood that the danger lies not in pleasure itself, but in its frequency. When something pleasurable ceases to be an exception and becomes routine, it begins to take up too much space. Mental space, financial space, emotional space. Constant pleasure robs us of something few realize, the ability to endure the discomfort necessary for growth. The person begins to avoid anything that requires effort, postpone difficult decisions, avoid important conversations, swap construction for relief. Solomon observed that no one loses discipline all at once. It dissolves little by little, always with justification. Only today. I deserve it. I'll make it up to you later. But the pleasure doesn't compensate for it. He's just asking for a repeat. And all unconscious repetition creates dependence. Solomon warned that pleasure without reflection weakens character, not out of malice, but for convenience. When life is organized around comfort, discomfort begins to seem intolerable. And it is at this point that bad decisions begin to seem reasonable. Immediate pleasure doesn't destroy plans. He postpones them, until one day there's no more energy to resume them. Solomon understood that the highest price of pleasure is not financial. It's time wasted on choices that build nothing. And the most dangerous thing is that this price only becomes apparent later, when the habit is already formed, when discipline is already weak, when the will no longer responds. Pleasure doesn't announce its price, but it always charges, and almost no one realizes when there's still time to stop. And that is precisely why Solomon warned against it. Because the quieter the pleasure, the more expensive it tends to be. And in the next point, it becomes clear why this type of pleasure never satisfies. It only increases hunger. Solomon warned that constant pleasure does not deliver lasting satisfaction. He delivers custom orders. First impressions make an impact. The second is comfort. The third, normality. After that comes the void. Solomon observed that human beings adapt quickly to what is easy. What once seemed special becomes commonplace, and what is common no longer fulfills. This is how silent dissatisfaction is born. People don't realize when pleasure stops bringing joy, and starts simply taking up space. She keeps searching, not because she enjoys it, but because she misses it when she doesn't have it. Solomon understood that repeated pleasure creates tolerance. The same stimulus no longer generates the same sensation. Then comes the need for more intensity, more frequency, more cost. Pleasure never says enough. It only weakens the boundary. Today this is happening clearly. Consumption increases, but satisfaction decreases. Rest is possible, but the tiredness persists. Distractions are constant, but the mind finds no peace. Solomon observed that this cycle does not begin with excess. It starts with emotional dependency. The person doesn't use pleasure to celebrate. She uses it to escape. Escape from boredom, discomfort, from reality itself. And the more she escapes, the less she tolerates being alone with herself. The more she tolerates being alone. Solomon warned that dissatisfaction arises not from a lack of things, but from an excess of stimuli. The mind loses its capacity for wonder. The heart loses the ability to feel gratitude. Everything seems insufficient. Everything seems to be happening too fast. Nothing remains. Constant pleasure creates a hunger that even the individual cannot satisfy. And then the person confuses pleasure with need. She believes she needs that in order to function properly, to relax, to feel alive. But Solomon understood that when something becomes necessary to generate well-being, it has already ceased to be healthy. The cycle closes in an almost invisible way. More pleasure, less satisfaction, more searching, more empty. People work harder to afford what they consume. Consume more to cope with what you experience. And she is always tired, even when surrounded by comfort. Solomon observed that continuous dissatisfaction erodes gratitude. And without gratitude, nothing is enough. Life becomes a sequence of short, shallow stimuli. No memory either. Nonsensical. Pleasure, which should be a pause, becomes routine. And routine, without purpose, becomes a burden. Solomon warned that the greatest danger of this cycle is that it becomes normalized. People think that's just how it is. That's how everyone lives. That there's no alternative. But there is a cost that accumulates silently. Focus lost. Wasted time. Energy drained. Dissatisfaction doesn't shout. She just accompanies them. Solomon understood that those who live seeking pleasure find no rest, because rest requires presence, and constant pleasure dissipates. And the more scattered the mind, the more stimulation it needs to feel alive. It's a self-perpetuating cycle, and the most dangerous thing is that it doesn't seem like a problem. It just seems like modern life. But Solomon warned, that which never satisfies is training you to never feel fulfilled. And in the next point, it becomes clear where this cycle leads. Because the bill doesn't just arrive in the mind, it arrives within the structure of life. Solomon observed that wealth is rarely lost in a single day. It's dripping, drop by drop, always in silence. It's not the big mistake that destroys everything. It's the repetition of the little ones. Solomon warned that constant pleasure weakens something essential for prosperity, discipline. And without discipline, no structure can stand for very long. Immediate pleasure teaches the brain to avoid effort. It trains the mind to choose the shortest path, even when that path leads nowhere. The person begins to negotiate with themselves. Postpone what requires focus. Ignore what requires consistency. Trading planning for impulse buying. Solomon understood that wealth is built through unseen decisions. Those that nobody applauds. Those that do not generate immediate pleasure. But they create a foundation. When pleasure takes over, these decisions begin to seem too burdensome. The person knows what they should do, but choose relief. And every time you choose relief, you weaken the habit of building. Solomon observed that pleasure does not destroy income. It destroys the destination of income. The money comes in, but it doesn't stay that way. Because there's always something calling. There's always an emotional reward waiting. Pleasure transforms gain into mere passage. Nothing lasts. Nothing accumulates. Over time, a person works more, but progresses less. The effort increases. The result was not. Solomon warned that unlimited pleasure creates a dangerous pattern, spending money to feel something. And when the feeling fades, it's used up again. It's not a lack of money. It's a lack of direction. Financial discipline doesn't die suddenly. She is weakened by emotionally justified choices. I deserve it. I'll adjust it later. That doesn't make that much of a difference. But Solomon understood that the difference is never in a single choice. It's in the pattern she creates. Repeated pleasure teaches the mind that discomfort should be avoided at all costs. And thriving requires the exact opposite, enduring discomfort now to reap the rewards later. When this principle is lost, wealth becomes unstable. She even shows up, but it doesn't stay that way. Solomon observed that many do not experience scarcity due to a lack of opportunity. They live by making too many concessions. Constant pleasure drains not only money, but also mental energy. The person loses clarity, loses focus. It loses consistency. Without consistency, no project grows. The most dangerous thing is that the pleasure always seems too small to cause harm, but it keeps happening again, and it is repetition that destroys. Solomon warned that what you do to feel better today may be sabotaging your stability tomorrow. Discipline is not lost through ignorance. She gets lost due to internal negotiation. And when this negotiation becomes a habit, the structure begins to give way. The bill arrives slowly, without fanfare, but that's enough. And when it arrives, many don't understand where they went wrong, because the mistake never seemed serious. Solomon understood this. That's why he was warning. And in the next point, it becomes clear that the cost of pleasure doesn't stop at money. He moves on to something even more valuable, peace and clarity. Solomon observed that excessive pleasure leaves no visible marks on the body, but it leaves noise in the mind. It doesn't hurt immediately. He's confused. A mind accustomed to constant stimulation loses the ability to rest. The silence is starting to become unsettling. The pause seems empty. The person feels the need to fill every space with something. Solomon understood that peace is not the absence of problems. It is a presence of clarity, and constant pleasure gradually dissolves that clarity. When everything becomes a stimulus, nothing is reflection. When everything is a distraction, nothing is present. Continuous pleasure fragments attention. It jumps to mind. It doesn't go into detail. It doesn't stay. Solomon observed that bad decisions rarely stem from malice. They are born from a tired mind. A tired mind reacts. You don't choose. She seeks immediate relief. And pleasure presents itself precisely there, like anesthesia, as a temporary escape from the burden of thinking. But Solomon warned, all prolonged anesthesia demands lucidity. People start living on autopilot, responding to messages without paying attention, works without being physically present, rest without resting. The pleasure, which should provide relief, becomes exhausting. But the person doesn't understand the cause. She just feels that something is always out of place. Solomon understood that clarity requires inner silence, and constant pleasure steals that silence. Today, the mind is rarely alone. There's always a sound, a screen, an incentive. The person can't stand being alone, and that's a serious sign. Solomon observed that those who cannot remain silent with themselves begin to run away from their own questions. And questions that are avoided become decisions that are postponed. Over time, life goes into reactive mode. Nothing is thought through in depth. Everything is answered. Constant pleasure prevents the discomfort necessary for maturing. Solomon warned that peace does not come from excessive comfort. It arises from internal order. And order requires limits. When pleasure knows no bounds, the mind loses its boundaries. Everything blends together. Everything gets mixed up. The person feels anxious without knowing why, fatigue without effort, dissatisfaction without a clear cause. Solomon observed that this is not bad luck. It's an effect. Frequent pleasure robs us of emotional depth. Joy becomes shallow. Sadness becomes confusing. Nothing gets resolved. Clarity is lost because there is no space to process it. Everything goes by too fast. Solomon understood that important decisions require a clear mind, and a clear mind requires pause. But constant pleasure eliminates the need for pause. He fills all the available slots. The most dangerous thing is that this seems normal. It looks like modern life. It looks like a break. But Solomon warned, a mind that is constantly stimulated is a mind that is easily led. Without clarity, A person accepts paths they wouldn't choose in silence. Without peace, she confuses urgency with importance. And so, small choices end up diverting the course of life. Solomon saw this happening repeatedly. That's why he was warning. And at the next point, everything comes together. Because there's a simple principle that protects against this hidden cost. Solomon did not oppose pleasure. He fought against the reversal of command. He understood that the problem was never about feeling pleasure. The problem is when pleasure starts to decide.